I always tell my students, let's get started now. Okay. Group 1 talked about the peculiar situation around textbooks, especially textbooks which are multidisciplinary, and about how that vision of a book shapes the authoring process, and in particular how it lends itself to annotation as a model of both authoring and maintenance, where a book kind of evolves at the edges of a textbook rather than rearranging things willy-nilly as if there wasn't anything kind of core content. We distinguish between 3 kinds of annotation: what you might call preemptive annotation, which is when an author writes things like footnotes or endnotes, where they're saying this is something you need to know, but not all the time. Maybe it's not quite the core content of this book, but it needs to be in the book. Then there's kind of a secondary annotation in an educational context where people who use the book, professors, let's say instructors, will add their own material to it to fill out something they think is either weaknesses or not appropriate from their perspective of their institution or their course. Then, of course, there's the student annotations where people write in the book as they use it. That's kind of a nice hierarchy of content, and it also is very much tied to the model that we heard from Rap Genius about kind of a hierarchy of annotators, where the authors who preemptively annotate clearly are higher status with respect to the content than those who are the students with the yellow marker going, I don't get this. Okay? Raises all sorts of interesting questions about the writing process and about whether we could have best practices and tool support for this kind of model of authoring and annotation. And that's probably what we'll talk about next year.
Okay, group 2. We talked about some extreme use cases for annotation. This one? No, this one? Okay.
No.
Both?
Don't worry about this one.
All right. In particular, data. We talked quite a bit about 3D data, 4D data, climate data. What happens if you want to just annotate the data set to say something is wrong here? Or how about things like, I used this piece of data. Here is some resources that were used to create this data. That led to quite a philosophical discussion about what annotation is, what annotation should be, what happens when annotation changes the content. You know, if you have a YouTube video and the annotation is embedded within the video, how can that remain malleable enough to then continue a conversation via annotation rather than having to reproduce yet another version of the YouTube video with one more annotation, and so on. That led to a discussion about objects and semantics, such as how do we annotate different versions of the same philosophical object, either if it has different URIs, so here is edition 1 of the book, here is edition 2, and so on, or different parts of the same resource, but it's the same object. So here is character A at the beginning of chapter 1, and they come back in chapter 3. I don't want to have to go through and annotate every single mention of that character to annotate that character. The same applies in video. If you want to annotate a golf club that's swinging on TV, here is Tiger Woods swinging his golf club. How do you track that through the video, or motifs in music? In terms of video, audio, and image, we wanted to annotate things via content features in the same way that we can quote text to say, I'm talking about this bit of the text, rather than giving a character offset. What about describing the features of the thing that we want to annotate in terms of colors, in terms of shapes, contrast, hue, and so on and so forth? So instead of just simple time codes within video, how can we annotate things with features? And interactive content. What happens when the user changes what they're annotating mid-annotation? What happens if the viewer of the annotation changes the thing as they're displaying the annotation, and so forth? This has particular reference to interactive games. There are lots of forums for walkthroughs and so on. Wouldn't it be nice to have that somehow able to be displayed within the game that you're playing to say, here is the Easter egg. And then Dan came around and said, hey, you need to wrap up. So that's about as far as we got.
So group number 3 talked about MOOCs, which are massive open online courses. All right, MOOCs. MOOCs, massive open online courses and learning management systems. The discussion there was about some of the central challenges when you have annotations in this particular space. To give you a sense of what this is about, in a massive open online course or a MOOC, you've got students who are generating their own notes, you've got teachers presenting their notes to students, and you're connecting documents and materials from all over the place in one particular space or in many spaces. And the challenge is, how do you take all of those varied annotations, process them, figure out which ones need to bubble up and become useful, and ultimately present them in a digestible way. And none of that is intuitive, and none of it really exists. And frankly, within a MOOC, there are multiple modalities by which annotations are presented. So you have text, you have audio, you have video, and you have the responsibility of an instructor to figure out ways that you can either annotate those modalities directly or allow students to interact with each other. This is itself a challenge. But there are also differences between teaching with annotations and researching the annotations themselves. So, for example, you may use annotations as a pedagogical tool. We talked about peer-to-peer teaching using annotations, but we also talked about the teacher or the instructor using the student's annotations as a way to determine whether or not the student actually is understanding the materials. And those types of challenges, and particularly the MOOC software and the learning management systems, have to accommodate the different needs of both, again, teaching with annotations as a pedagogical method and researching it to make sure that you know what your students are doing. And making this all the more complicated is the fact that learning management systems right now are one-to-many. In other words, the instructor is putting together the materials and pushing it out to the students, and there's not really a space right now for learning management systems to do annotation. But to make it even worse, even if there was a place to do annotation, that's not the future of learning management systems, because course materials don't exist in one space. You have disparate sources. They could be anywhere and disparate throughout the web. And so to have a really well-structured learning management system for a MOOC, you'd have to provide for a central annotation system across a disparate set of course materials. So, for example, you might have an article that you're citing to that's not embedded into the learning management system but may exist in a separate space, but you need to know whether the students are actually looking at that material and processing the material back into your learning management system. There were some other interesting conversations that we had about whether the use of annotation is actually too narrow of a concept for this domain, and the answer was maybe, but probably not. That it's still presenting a mark on the underlying content, and even if the implication of annotation is something narrower, this actually applies pretty broadly because you are marking the course materials. And then we also talked about whether this is something that needs to be taught or whether this is something that instructors and professors sort of intuit, and the answer is it operates on a range, and so you want to make sure that the MOOC software and learning management systems accommodate both of those needs. So that's what Group 3 talked about.
Project at Stanford working on called the Kuna Stories, where we're putting together a bunch of multimedia objects. There were some really good questions about how we might curate these things. So we have what we're calling a multi and make potentially unforeseen connections among them, and then the connections you might make it in public, private if you want to, but hopefully public so that others can see what you're doing. And then say you go to
another kind of extreme idea is to think about virtual reality or the web of things, annotating stuff in the world. If you're driving down the street and there's a pothole, you could annotate the pothole and send it to your city manager. The one also thing in the blind, in a way they're not concerned by the visual representations, they can think about annotation. As we right now are trying to figure out how to display annotations in a way that's not confining or confusing. And a couple of other unanswered questions that we had is for annotating videos, we need to be able to annotate the actual things in the frames of the video, the images, not just a time segment, and having a way to map target identity in annotation targets so that people can use different vocabularies, but we know that it's talking about the same thing.
Specifically the identity of unique identifiers in attribution. And as we were talking about it, one of the things that came up is, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about the identity of the person, how that person presents themselves to the people who are reading their annotations, or is it the other way? Things that cut across all of those different sites. The other thing that we talked about quite a bit was this concept of mobile. So even though you're a musician, you can very often shows that you're an expert at something. And you may be an expert in several different things that are really kind of unconnected. So maybe you're that was really important. And kind of related to that is this concept level of anonymity that you can have, particularly in some environments where it's not appropriate or desirable for people to. So an example of this might be in a story important it is, both for talking about how that.
Hi, our hashtag was tinyurl/Annotation. Oh, just the handle. Okay, so we talked about annotator pain points and features. So like I said, the tiny URL was tinyurl.com/annopane, ANNOPane. So to start it off, we talked about that there's a few versions of Annotator, so we kind of need a context of what we're talking about. So there's 1.2, which is a maintenance branch, not much new coming out of there. There's has their own branch, which is elaborated on that he's not sure what the best way to handle it is. People also wanted better selection on mobile devices, less brittle anchoring, support for thousands of annotations on the same page. So he says get involved and help work on better testing, better documentation. And that's it.